Today's session is about configuring UniPhi for using it as a feasibility tool. Tomorrow we will actually use the model that we developed today, and I'm actually going to show you how you can build multiple models, because obviously various projects require completely different cost-benefit analysis around their performance. So today is all about configuration. It's quite heavy duty around that. I'll try and go nice and slow. I'm recording. Feel free to jump in, and I'll check every now and then if anyone's chatting to me. So just if you do chat, I might come back to it like a couple of minutes or 5 minutes after you've asked the question, but I will loop back. I'm getting better at that with all this practice I've been having lately. So we'll see how we go. All right, so you'll see across the modules across the top that there's a module here called Feasibility. That's a new module. It is the first module that we're actually charging for separately. Everything else, normally a subscription, gets you access to the modules of that subscription. For example, team member doesn't have costs and contracts and revenue, but everything else does. So you kind of get everything with the system once you subscribe. But as you'll see, I think in this demonstration, there's a lot of intellectual property, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of engine behind here that we're seeing as being a bespoke product. So it's still an unlimited, as many users as you subscribe to kind of concept once you've paid a fee, but there is a one-off, well, I say one-off, a yearly subscription to that module, and that price of that is 10,000 Australian dollars. As I said, that's for if you had 1,000 users, they could all then access it for that price, on top of obviously their subscription fees for those 1,000 users. So that's the fixed yearly price to access that module. And the goal out of all of this is when I say feasibility, is to be able to model scenarios of net present value IRR results and determine best investment paths, both discretely within a project, but also across portfolio. So to begin with, and I should also say that maybe I'll start at the end. If I go into that feasibility module, the goal of what we're going to do today, because the other thing I should explain is that the feasibility module and UniPhi in its entirety is a platform. It's a piece of software that's designed for you to create your model. There's limitless cost-benefit models that you can have, and that's why most people do them in Excel, because you build it in Excel. So with that same concept in mind, you're using the tools that UniPhi can give you to develop your own model for whatever asset you're talking about. It could be an IT project that gets benefits from productivity, it could be a retirement aged care facility, it could be a new residential tower, it could be a new product launch for cosmetics. It doesn't really matter. And so the idea is that you can use the tools here to build your own model, and that's the key. It's not kind of like Estate Master, where it's already been designed with all of the property-based feasibility in mind. This is designed to enable you to build a feasibility model for any type of investment. And our goal in terms of usability, with our new mantra at UniPhi being, we want to build software that people want to use, is the idea is that you can go into the feasibility module of a new project, completely new project, go to the driver's page, and everything presents there for you to key in. And then you don't need to key in anything anywhere else. That's all you need to do. And once you've keyed in all of these pieces of data that are your variables for your feasibility, you hit save and you have an MPV result. That's our goal. And you'll also have attached to that the funding options that make up that feasibility. So the feasibility module includes not just the asset assessment, the MPV and the IRR, but also how you would go about funding it, how much bank funding or debt funding you're going to need, and what that interest cost is going to be. Now, all of that should be calculated by entering in this particular page. So it's a one-page variable data entry. And then what you're able to do is change those variables as often you like, and when you do change them, snapshot them as scenarios, and then you'll see in tomorrow's presentation how that flows through to having a dashboard of those options for people to consider, and what the effect on MPV is or IRR is to those changes in drivers. So today what we want to do is show how this screen gets created and how the engine behind it gets built, that when you enter in everything into this screen and hit save, it actually calculates an MPV. It's a quite an exhaustive process. It's we have a lot of experience at it now here, and we can provide consulting advice, obviously at a cost to you to do that, or you can watch the recording of this webinar and others that I'm going to do into the future and work it out yourself. And so this is the end of the sort of process. Now we're going to go to the start, and it all starts with project custom fields. The reason for that is that, as I said, we want feasibilities to be limitless. We want you to create whatever you want. And so we're utilizing an engine in UniPhi that already exists that enables you to create whatever type of field you want to create. And so if I go into that hamburger at the top left, if you're a system administrator, you'll have this configuration option. And there's lots of things to select in all of that. And if I drop down to the project option within configuration, there'll be a sub-navigation, one of which is custom fields. And so maybe people have never seen these before because you're not system admin, but they exist. They're on the screen now. And so I've had a few people either enter or leave, so I'm just going to check there's no conversation. So if there are new people, I'll just quickly bring you up to date. Well done, Dave. Good to see you got on the call. You haven't missed anything. We're just kicking in now. Okay. Okay, so you go to these custom fields sub-navigation, and you've got two sections to the page. The first one is custom field categories, and they're very important. They're the way you're going to group your data input fields. So the project custom fields are here for your variables, you know, the number of product you're going to sell, over what period of time, the floor area of your building, and the dollar per square meter of floor area that you're going to charge, and the net lettable space. However, whatever the variables or the metrics, the key data input metrics that you want to create in your model, you then want to categorize those into sort of headings. So when you go to the data input page, it helps the end user to key things in. And our project custom fields are used for more than just feasibility. And so when you design the next stage of your model, which I'll show you in a moment, that will determine which ones get included in the feasibility screen. So in this stage, you just have to ignore the ones that don't mean anything to you. So as I scroll down this custom field category list, you'll see that there's a benefits driver and a cost driver. We've done a few iterations of this over the time. Initially, we just did one called feasibility. Now we've split that up into three sections. There's benefit driver, cost driver, and timeline. And so they're the three that are going to aggregate all of the data inputs for a feasibility model. And then when I scroll down, you then get to a second card. These are called cards, and this is where you can add custom fields. And you can see from the ones that have already been added that you can link that custom field to a category. You can give it a name. It will be, you can create custom fields that you update monthly, and that will be called a financial period custom field, but all of the feasibility custom fields will be whole of project. And then you give the data type for the field. So there's a variety of data types. Then what you can do is link this particular field name to sectors, types, service lines, or locations. And this is one of the ways you start to build multiple models. So if I just click add here for a moment, goodness gracious, the chips. There we go. All of those options get presented to you as a data entry input field for creating a new field. So you give it a name, a category. So if it was related to costs, you would select cost drivers. Related to benefits, benefits. If it was a timeline thing, you'd select timeline. That'll stay at whole of projects. So you never really need to key that. That's an order of the layout. So you can change the layout on the screen. So you're kind of being a graphical user interface designer when you create these things, and that's very important to look through, and it takes a few iterations, and you can go back and edit this later. All it's doing is picking the next number. So there's actually 153 custom fields in this particular database. And then what you can do is say, well, this model is going to be related to aged care, or this is going to be a commercial model, or this is going to be a internal IT model, residential, what have you. And that's the way you'd be able to build up multiple models. Or you might link them to the project type. You might have a different model for and even both for refurbs versus new builds and greenfield versus brownfield, etc. like that. And so the way you do that is you create these models and link them project types so that when you create a new opportunity and you classify that opportunity as being a brownfield site in the aged care sector, all of those fields that relate to that will be presented to the end user. And you can see then the list of data types. When building a financial model or a feasibility model, you're mainly looking at number and currency. And so they're the two that you're dealing with. You also can deal with date. So they're the three that we'd be dealing with in this scenario. But there are others there that get used for other purposes. And so you keep doing that iteratively. You'd probably work outside of UniPhi to define what your variables are and go through them and have them written down so that you can then come in here and get someone else to key them in if you like. It's a bit of a mind-numbing task. But what you'll see here is the first example is under benefits drivers. So this is an example of a IT-related model built for call centers. So some of the metrics we want to capture is number of calls, time saving per call, reduction in call numbers, old cost per call, new cost per call. And you can build as many of those up as you like. You can see the cost per call is a currency, numbers of calls, time saving, number of calls are all numbers, and they're all linked to this sector called information technology, or project type, I think it is actually. And so it's only when projects are in information technology would you be presented with this data. As I scroll down, we'll look at it from a different perspective. This is for construction, and we have land purchase price, construction costs, capital upgrade percentages, that's for aged care in a new build. Then you got construction upgrade cost per decanting, refurbish. These fields I made up. I worked with people in aged care. They told me, you know, how things work, what variables exist. We wrote them all down, and then I came in here and I keyed them into UniPhi. And I linked them so that we were going to present, you know, the relevant pieces of data. And again, there's actually two modules around aged care. There's aged care facilities, which is for sort of people, you know, older who are needing higher levels of care. They have nurses and things like that. And then there's independent living units, which are more about, you know, just having a you know, downsizing into a common place to where you got residents that you can socialize with, I guess, and whatever else makes you want to go and live in one of those places. And they actually have different regulations, different revenue models, and different ways to track their feasibility. So on the cost side, it's very similar. You can see that there's not much differentiation being done. But then on the revenue side, there's quite a lot. And then you can see on the cost side, we've got our IT one coming in. So a lot of noise, but you wouldn't have all that many for your own business. You're going to be in one or the other. And we're looking at ways to filter out. If I applied information technology to the filter, I should only get that. And then as I scroll down, if you're doing construction-related feasibility, you're really looking at revenue rather than benefits. So in this instance, we labeled it revenue drivers. And then you've got a bunch of variables around that, your occupancy rate, length of stay. This again is an aged care facility thing. Whereas these ones here are just a pure residential assessment. Number of one-bedroom apartments you're building, number of two-bedroom, you can create number 3, 4, 5, etc. However many configurations you want. And you know, if you're going to do a build and rent model, you can do 1-bedroom rent per week, 2-bedroom rent per week, etc. And so, you know, 150 custom fields there. These are examples of what you can come up with. So again, aged care facility, there were 3 types of configurations. So type A, type B, and type C to give it a standard, and away you go. If there was more, or if you wanted to label them differently, you can do that. It's entirely up to you. And once you've done all of that, that's basically created the data entry variables for your model. What we then need to do, so this would be the same in Excel, you would create these fields for people to enter in. You probably highlight them a different color so that they know they have to key stuff into those fields. And then you'd have another spreadsheet with all the formulas behind it that's going to calculate how much revenue and how much cost you're going to have. And so that's the same in UniPhi. Once you're happy that you've got everything you need here in your custom fields, you're now going to go to a configuration area that's called metrics. And again, this is a generic piece of kit, can be used for other things. It's used by quantity surveyors to do their benchmarking. They'll divide the elemental cost by floor area to get floor rates and look at the quantity of external walls to the floor area to get floor control quantities around wall to floor ratios. So it's the same product, but this time being used for feasibility. And I'm just going to go to it now, and then I'm just going to check that there's no questions coming at me. Okay, so feel free to use the chat function. We did have someone come in and go, unfortunately. Brings a tear to the eye. Right, so now where I've gone, I'm still in the configuration. I still need to be a system administrator to access this. And our metrics are associated to charts of accounts. That's how they come into the revenue, cost, and feasibility modules. So every time you build metrics, you have to build them against the relevant chart of accounts that you're going to capture against. I'm going to talk about chart of accounts in the next section of this particular presentation, but so for now, they're not too important. It's in the next bit. But you do need to have one already built, and you need to have thought about the things I'm going to talk about in the next section before coming to this bit. And so there's two types of metrics. The only ones that really matter for feasibility are the sort of whole of project metrics. But what you can do is get the system to calculate metrics around each row in your chart of accounts. So if you've got preliminaries and construction costs and architect fees and engineering fees, etc., it will calculate, for example, those fees over floor rate row by row down the page. That's what calculated columns is doing. And you can see an example of that if I was to go to NPWC, which is the National Public Works Committee's elemental chart of accounts. And if I go to the chart of accounts section of that, you'd see it there. And what this is doing is saying, okay, I want to create calculated columns on the cost per square meter of fully enclosed covered area, on the cost per square meter of gross floor area, and the net lettable area efficiency. And what it's doing then is each budget line, it's dividing that, whatever is in that budget line, by the project custom field that we created called FICA. So FICA, GFA, and NLA doesn't exist in UniPhi out of the box. A system administrator creates those custom fields, just like I did in the previous section, and then they become available in here. You don't need to know that formula. If you click add, there's a name, which can be, as we had there, dollars per square meter of, let's say, unenclosed covered area. And then you can get to choose the format, and it's obviously got a dollar in it, so it's currency, and how many decimal places you want to calculate that to. And then you need to say, well, what is that formula? And it tells you all the available fields you have to play with. And so you could do a control quantity ratio instead. So we could call this wall to floor. And instead we would do the budget line quantity divided by the project custom field called FICA, which is the fully enclosed covered area, or commonly in Australia referred to as the floor area. Now, that's going to do it for every single quantity, so you wouldn't really do that on wall to floor because it'll have all the different other elements to it, like windows and doors and other things. But as an example of building the formula up, you're not actually typing the letters, you're just actually looking at what's available to you in the system and referencing that, and using common Excel-based mathematical operators like the backslash for divide. If I switch to metrics, this is where I'm going to create my model. And if I go to the residential first, I'll do FISO revenue. So this is just looking at a rental model. You could do a build and sell model as well, obviously. And you can see here, again, you can create these categories, and again, they're there to make it easier for people to understand the data that they're interpreting, and that's up to you. When you click add, there's just a simple little text box to fill in, and then you can apply the metrics to that text box when you go to use it. When you click add here, it's the same as what we did on the columns. You associate it to a category, you give it a name, say there was a third bedroom, rental revenue or something like that. probably would be better giving it the same naming convention. I'm terrible at stuff like that. So 2BR rent would have been the way to go. And then to build that up, I would need to have the 2-bedroom rent per week, which I don't have. I only had 2 custom fields, one for 1-bedroom rent per week and one for 2-bedroom rent per week. But you can see in this formula here, and if I was to replicate that, I would scroll here, 1-bedroom rent per week, use the times symbol, little asterisk there, by the number of 1-bedroom quantity that we've got in this, which has been done as number. So if we come down to, you could use that number of 1-bedroom, or I think I had it as a full word, number of 1-bedroom apartments. And so that's timesing the rent by the number of 1-bedroom apartments. Now, that's going to be for 1 week. So we need 52 weeks in the year. Then we need to multiply it by our occupancy rate. And as we're going to ask people to enter that into as whole numbers, like 95 equaling 95%, you then divide that by 100. And then for how long are we going to rent this building out for? So one of the data inputs from the project custom fields was investment duration. And so what that's done is it's calculated the total rent you're going to get from all of the 1-bedroom units that you're building in this apartment block. And the same for 2-bedroom. And so on and so forth. So, and then investment duration is there to build the cash flow element of that model, because what I'll show you later is how you can actually derive what timeline to discount this over based on the key data inputs as well. So the person would be entering in 1-bedroom rent, 2-bedroom rent, and investment duration, and then that would then, from that information, calculate their cash flow for the positive side over the life of that investment. Hit save and you got yourself that metric. Same with switching to the cost chart of accounts. So that's the revenue side. If I go to Feasibility costs, you'll see we've got land costs, construction duration. We can have a whole bunch of other things in there too, like the percent that's going to be spent on consulting fees and all that sort of stuff, and you can build it up to be as complex as you need. So for example, if I go to one of the aged care ones, you see that around the development costs, you've got construction, capital upgrade, renovation duration, land purchase price, and total construction upgrade costs. In addition to others we've built for clients where we've actually added in there the percent of consulting fees and marketing fees and other fees around that construction, because then you can actually have it as one data input stream that actually links right through. So we'd have to actually add a few into this model to get it to link right through, which I'll do overnight and then demonstrate tomorrow how you only have to key into one page. But yeah, the idea is to every single data input you could possibly think of gets created as a custom field and then incorporated into a formula in here to determine how much it's going to be. And all of this is calculating whole of investment cost. It's not a timeline. The timeline will come through the auto-phasing capability of UniPhi. And so once you're happy that all of that model's been developed, and as you can see, there's a lot to do around that depending on the complexity, including timeline. Once you're finished with that and you're happy, you can now progress to the next stage. So what's key in that is to understand the custom fields you've created, what they're going to be used for, and then coming in here and clicking add, and then using this interface to determine what you want to do to calculate a whole of project value for the lines that you're calculating that for. And within that, the chart of accounts would become quite important. So you need to have an idea of what this structure looks like. So I'm going to go to that now. And like I have done on every other step, I'll just pause after that. So under configuration again, there's an option called chart of accounts. And if I go into, for example, aged care cost, because it's feasibility, it's a lot more high level than you would have sort of a detailed design or something like that. And so what we've got, you could probably, stop from there for most of the development. The rest is aged care specific. How much your land is, stamp duty, construction cost, state works and main contract, consultant fees phased into life cycles, marketing costs, and other construction costs. And so, thinking about that structure, you kind of need to build a formula for every level 3 code. So in the metric system, you need to have a formula that's going to calculate every single line there, and you'd need to have a data input for people to be able to key in the variables that drive that. So a common one would be to chuck in one construction cost number that would come into main works, and then a percent of construction costs for feasibility, concept, detailed, and post-contract. And then it'll derive, say it's 2.5%, whatever the main contract cost is, 2.5% of that will be added on for feasibility. We're going to spend 15% of our construction cost on marketing, 10% on FF&E, 20% contingency, 10% statutory fees, whatever you think is a valid number. But those data inputs need to be created as custom fields and then built in as formulas to generate the number that's going to come into this cost. So there's 3 steps to building the underlying model. It's creating the data input screen, which is done through the custom fields, building the formula engine that uses those data inputs to generate a whole of project investment value and a timeline, and then building the chart of accounts that those costs are going to be allocated against and revenue is going to be allocated against. So again, if I come up here and change the chart structure, go back to aged care revenue, this is the revenue from those projects. So you need to structure that up as well, and then work out how each line of that is being calculated. So for every line here, there would be a metric line that aligns to it. You just need to make sure that's happening. Then the other type of chart of accounts that exists for feasibility, which is new and you only have it if you have the feasibility module, is the funding one. And you can see here it's a new type. So when you create a chart of accounts, you'll have a variety of types to select. So this is a new chart from blank we're going to create. You have project cost, internal revenue, internal cost, and funding. Project cost is used when you're managing someone else's money. And so we don't want that to be muddied with our own money. And so that exists. One of our clients came back to us very validly recently and said, well, we're actually managing the revenue for a client as well. So can we have a project revenue chart of account? So that's in the pipeline now. So that was an interesting one. So there'll be a 5th one in the future. Internal revenue is obviously your own income. Internal cost is your own expense and capital costs. And then funding is how are you going to fund the difference between internal revenue and internal cost. And there's a few elements to that. It's a special chart of accounts. It's got some functionality that doesn't exist in the other ones. So if I go into that one flagged as funding, you'll see what I mean. We've utilized the concept of code type. Now, normally code types you create yourself and manually describe account codes so that you can aggregate them later. A common one is aggregating all of the construction costs into one, including consulting fees and that, and then other development costs into another bucket. So it's a way of aggregating. Another one is CapEx versus OpEx and things like that. But in this, it's different. What we want you to do is, again, you create this structure. It's entirely up to you, and you can have as many facilities, debt facilities as you like. This has got 2, but we didn't flesh out what facility 2 was made up of, but it'd be the same as this. What each facility would have is a drawdown where you're basically borrowing from the bank to build your project, and that's classed as debt. Then you've got interest on that debt, then you've got a line fee on that debt, then you've got an application fee, which we call other expenses. And then you've got the eventual repayment of that, which is repaid back from principal and interest. There are very specific things that do different things. So it'll automatically calculate the interest on your debt based on how much you've drawn down. So when you select those code types, it actually provides and brings in functionality. Same with them when we get down to the equity side, it'll automatically calculate as the residual. So equity is the last man standing. It's the profit or the loss of whatever it is that you're doing. So once it's calculated all of the debt that you're using to finance this and any manual adjustments that you've put in to the cash flow, it'll say whatever's left is the auto calc of how much money you as the investor needs to kick into this gig to make it stay afloat. And that's all automatically calculated for you at the end. Okay. So once you've set all of that up, you've got most of what you want from your model. You're 90% of the way there. The next bit is to actually go into the revenue and the cost and the feasibility modules and set up what we call the derivatives that are going to daisy chain the calculations throughout the model, kind of like linking cells in Excel and getting it to drive the one data input screen drives all of the feasibility. And so if I go to revenue first, now some of this isn't set up 100% how we would like it yet, but hopefully it'll demonstrate the concept. I'm going into a project that's already got data. The idea in this is that you wouldn't, oh, that's a real bad one. You wouldn't need to necessarily, what you'd want to do is create one that's blank like this. And then when you key in your variables, what happens is, that's better. Sorry about that. What happens is that all of your metrics that you created with formulas come in down the bottom here. Okay, so they're calculated via that formula engine that I showed you before. And so that is the whole of investment period, not whole of project, whole of investment period revenue that you're going to generate from this asset. Two things we need to do to that. We need to get it into our chart of accounts, because then we can take advantage of our phasing capability to then phase that over time so that we can then get a discounted cash flow. So the way we do that is we use these functions called derivatives. And if you have a look at all of these numbers here, say 100%, what they're doing is they're taking their value from the metric that's displayed below. And the functionality that does that is these little arrows. So it is time consuming to set this up once, but if I wanted to do it again, I can copy this project as a template project and the model is already set up. It's already got these derivatives defined. So what happens is I click in and I would put up the top here, this is 100% of something, and the something that it's 100% of is the metric called initial RADs. Now, retirement deposits are bonds that aged care people pay to actually enter in a aged care facility, and they actually get 100% of that bond back. Unfortunately, it's to their estate normally, because that's where you go to die. So, you know, if you pass away, your family gets whatever you've put in back, but you don't get anything more than that. You just get 100% of what you put in. So if you stay in there for a long time, the time value of that would have been destructive in value. But essentially it's accommodation free. You're not paying anything for that accommodation other than the bond. Having said all of that, aged care providers recognize that as a benefit to their project straight up. And so that's the initial payments that you get. And then obviously through turnover, when someone leaves and you get someone new, and you've normally increased the price by then, so there's this value proposition in turnover. And so that's the ongoing price bit. Not all people pay a big fat bond, because some of them are quite expensive. Some people pay rent, and that's called a DAP, and some people get paid by the government, and that's called concession. So there's three revenue sources. In those sources, some is initial, some is ongoing, and that's all being calculated by formulas based off a data input sheet in UniPhi. And it comes in here, and we say, okay, we've now mirrored that in our chart of accounts, and we're saying that this particular code, the RAD initial code, derives its revenue 100% from the metric called RAD initial revenue, or initial RADs in this instance. And so even though this says 39 million based off its variables, if I go and copy this particular project to a new project, the value will be 0, but the derivative will be there. It'll be 100% of whatever I'm going to put in. And so to sort of demonstrate that, if I go to the summary screen now and I click copy, one of the things that pops up when you do copy is budget. If I tick that, it'll copy both revenue and cost budget for this project, which includes the model. If I did it on this one, it would actually copy the numbers as well. So that's why you basically set up a blank one with all of those derivatives. It doesn't have any values in it, but it has the derivative models defined. And once you've done that, you can copy it 100 times and you never need to set it up again. And so once you've set it up once, it's like a spreadsheet you're setting up for the first time, and you're sending it out to 50,000 people to key in. They can then, you know, copy that and basically use that model from there. And so that's an example of derivatives. So if I go to cost, it's exactly the same, with one subtle difference. It's not always 100%. So here you can see the derivative data input has been brought into the cost module. What we've done now, this has been not updated since we did a few tweaks, there is only one data input sheet, but the concept is still the same. This is 10% of the construction price. So instead of linking to the metric, it links to the, well, in this instance it does, there's the metric there, total construction upgrade cost, $45 million, and we're going to pay 10% of that cost on feasibility, or $45,000 in this instance. A point, yeah, 10%. Or is that 0.1% in that? Sorry, it is 0.1. That is a whole number, so it's a fraction. $45,000 business case, that's pretty good. And 0.5% and 1% and 2%, so quite low. But these are made up numbers, probably invalid benchmarking would tell you. And so all of these are derivatives less than 100%, and they're all based on that construction price. So if you go and change the construction price, it'll concertina down to all of these fields. What we, as I said, the only difference now is that we derive both. We derive the number here and the number that it's derived from. So yeah, so you don't have to actually come into here and key anything in. It's all keyed in the one sheet. These are all the metrics classified into their categories so that you can read them. And then, like I said before, if you've got this set up once, you don't need to do it again. So what that will do is it'll basically give you a cost for your investment, $664 million in this, and aged care are huge because they do 50-year timelines of paying people to get out of their bond and come back in again. So the construction cost is only 45 of that, but it's upfront. And as you discount 50 years into the future, it's nominal anyway. And the revenue model, so that's all set up as well. What we haven't done is we haven't timelined it. And so if I go to auto phasing, you can see here that every code in that list has an automatic phasing method to it. And a model that's been set up like that. So if you give the system a start date and a duration, it will automatically apply, and an escalation rate, it'll automatically apply this model to the phasing no matter which one you use. So everything has, if it said manual, then that would be, you have to key it in yourself, but everything here doesn't. Everything is automated. So we have an S-curve for the construction costs, we have monthly for the consulting costs, and in fact everything else. And we have escalation. So what that will do is it'll take that 45 million and escalate it by 3% per annum over the life of the major construction contract, which is this 36-month time frame over here. And then the system will tell you how much of the overall cash flow is escalation and how much of it is at original cost. And the way that these months get in here is, again, we have our little drill through arrow, and you derive those fields. So you derive the escalation rate to the data input screen called escalation. You derive the start date to a data input field called construction start date. And you derive the months to a data input field called, say, construction duration. Yeah, there actually isn't one here, which we need to get. These are all for refurbs. So, oh, is that new build there? Yeah, that one there. So that, basically, when you select those, they automatically go into the relevant fields in that phasing screen. So that escalation rate isn't getting keyed into this screen, it's getting keyed into the one data page, and it's automatically, like an Excel link, getting put into there. The duration, obviously it's now disappeared because I linked it to a field called duration, and that hasn't been keyed in. And then the start date gets derived from the start date. 36 months plus the start date gives you end date, and then everything else links to that. So you can see start to finish on different codes, and it'll just concertina down. So you set that up. The variables will change from the data input screen, but the relationships won't between the codes. You copy this project into a new project. The model is already set up with all of this already selected, and there's nothing more for you to do. Revenue works the same way. And then what happens with feasibility is we use the same concept, but we're linking across charts of accounts. So we go to feasibility and we go to budget, and you can see now that's our feasibility chart of accounts, right? So how much we're drawing down, what the interest is, line fee, application fee, right? Where does it get its data from? And you can see some of the quirks of a funding chart of accounts. It's got, okay, that's the debt line. how much are you wanting to fund this project's construction period by debt? How do I know construction period? I'll tell you in a minute. 75% of the construction costs. And I know that a lot of developers will try and put 100% in there, but so we're trying to fund 75% of our construction through debt. But the bank has told us we've got a $20 million limit. So if we draw up to 20 million, even if it's not 75%, it'll no longer let us go above that. So you can put that debt limit in. The only reason that knows it's there is because we put debt as the code type to draw down. And like I said, you could have multiple facilities. One might fund the land, another might fund the construction costs only, and then equity has to fund the consulting fees. Who knows? Then because we class these as interest, we're putting in the interest rate there. And then because we class this as expense, there's a one-off fee for the application. And we've put that in there. That's 75% and of what? 75% of what? Because there's more than just construction costs in this particular project, is defined through this arrow, similar to what we were talking about before in terms of the derivative. So what we've said is, please fund out of debt 75% of my construction costs and my other construction costs. I could have done land as well. I could have done ongoing building costs. I could have done whatever I want. And if you build a separate model that's based on, infrastructure or based on number of, nice smelling perfumes you're going to do, you could do the same sort of thing. How much the factory's going to fund that by debt, but not the operating costs of running the thing. I don't know. Up to you to tick those boxes. And you can see that even though I'm in the funding chart, I can actually link to any chart of accounts, including revenue over here and costs there. So in this particular one, I said 75% of construction costs and other construction costs. And what that means is that when I go and do my estimate for costs and I phase it out through that model that I showed you before, the funding is actually automatically updating dynamically every time I change a number. And so when I look at which isn't anything to do with MPV, but it is something you want to give to the banks to say, this is when I'm going to come to you for money and this is how much. So I'm just waiting for that to go back. While that spins a little bit for me, unfortunately, I'll just check in with you guys. No questions? Come on.
Yeah, I had one question, Mark. So that where basically you've got those, derivatives or linking the fields in the phasing. Is that only available where you've set up metrics against that chart of accounts, or is it only available if you're using the feasibility module?
The funding chart of accounts only exists in the feasibility module. So if you don't have the feasibility module, you don't have the funding chart of accounts, and it's all in the funding chart of accounts. Because what happens now is you can see that it said that facility 1 is 17 plus 1455 equals $19 million. Yep. The way that gets calculated, if you look at manual phasing, we did our attempt at graphical user interface here. The blue are the lines in the cost code that it's actually funding. So you can actually see when the costs are coming in and when they're going to be funded. So you can see that $548,000 is being kicked into this project in September 2021 on construction and other construction costs, and that's all being funded by the drawdown here. And so that's not keyed inable, that's all calculated. And so yeah, it's through that derivative two ticks that I did, but you can only do that in the feasibility module. There's nowhere else where you can get that done. All the other phasing is done through the auto phasing screen, like I set up before, with derivatives of duration and derivative of start date. And what I mean by all of that then is when I go to the drivers page, this is the only place I have to key stuff in, right? So if I come down to timeline, I chuck in construction duration, years, construction start date. They're all linked to the auto phasing of the feasibility. And so if I type it in here and hit save, it concertinas through the revenue module, through the cost module, through the funding module, everything gets phased out. We chuck in a discount rate, which to cause me grief is actually on the summary screen of this project. We haven't got that pulled into this screen yet. But it tends to be a standard anyway. And bang, you've got yourself an MPV. So if I go to the summary screen here, you'll see here, we've got a discount rate keyed in, and every time I do some changes, that number will change and the IRR will change automatically. So you key that discount rate into here instead of in the one summary page to rule them all. So maybe that needs to change at some stage. But yeah, you do need to key that 10% in. And once you do that, it'll just generate, the calculations. So, we've had it with a client where we've literally been able to go to this page on a new blank screen, new project, key in these 20 data points, hit save, and we've got ourselves a calculation because the model's already defined. All that stuff I've gone through for the last 50 minutes is defined once and used as often as you need it to. And what that means is I can then snapshot that, give it a name, and then what we've designed in our Power BI dashboards is a neat little feasibility dashboard that shows you the outcomes of different scenarios. So go to that one. And the tab called Feaso. And I don't know how well you can see that. I'll try and, it doesn't resize very well. But this is saying base case scenario, and this is saying construction increase and rent drop. And you can see that the result is, we've gone from a positive MPV here. So this is the MPV result, 7 million in base case scenario and negative 2.5 in the construction increase scenario. And this is telling me what changed as a visual. So, that red line is other, which is the construction rent. And, that's the biggest impact. It's not as big as, it's much bigger here than here. It must be a cost actually. And you can hover over each one of these and see, construction cost, there it is there, 19 versus 24. So that's the big change. So visually you can see the changes between your options. And we had one with eight scenarios along there as well. So for a different project. So, that data is there on the page. You can see this profiles, I mean, aged care is crazy because of the timeline, but this profiles the spend. So this is the land purchase. This is the construction purchase, like building the asset. And then this is your revenue profile afterwards, which is a rental sort of revenue profile coming in there. And, that would be more useful, I imagine, on a product development type NPV or something like that, where you can see the S-curves and work out, whether that's a valid ramp up of your product, whether it's going to go that viral or not, pardon the pun. But yeah, so that capability and even this dashboard is entirely open to the end user to change and build and create what they want. And so tomorrow we're going to actually build a calculation from scratch and end up back in this screen using the model rather than showing you how to build the model. So it's just purely on using the model and how you can create these scenarios and drive the model. But that's essentially how you build it. Start with custom fields, then metrics, then chart of accounts, and then derivatives. And, after about 3 months of effort, you've got yourself a model you can use. Depends. I mean, the aged care ones were incredibly complex.
Yes, I remember. A
straightforward residential Feaso would be a lot easier, which is what I'll do tomorrow. I'm not going to do aged care to blow people's heads, but yeah, straight up, build and sell villa of 8 units, and we'll show you how it works.